Good evening. I am Boston University Provost David Campbell, and on behalf of all of us here at Boston University, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2006 University Lecture. Established in 1950, the University Lecture provides us with an opportunity to learn from a distinguished member of the Boston University faculty who is actively engaged in outstanding research or scholarship. It is a forum open to all, students, faculty, and staff at the university, as well as our neighbors in the greater Boston area, and that involves us in the consideration of issues that are important to our understanding of the world around us. Over the decades, the lectures have galvanized discussion, provoked inquiry, educated and informed us about topics as diverse as language acquisition, presidential disability, genomics, and the atmospheres of distant planets. Despite the continuing trend toward interdisciplinary collaboration and research, it remains rare, even in academia, to hear a lecture from someone with expertise in a realm entirely different from one's own. The beauty of the university lecture is that all of us, humanists, scientists, engineers, and medical practitioners alike, come together to learn, be inspired, and open our eyes to the wider world. As a physicist and engineer, I am greatly looking forward to hearing this evening's presentation by one of our most eminent historians. And so I am very pleased to ask Bob Brown, Boston University's 10th president, to introduce tonight's lecturer and her topic. Bob?
Thank you, David. Good evening and welcome to the 2006 University Lectureship. It's a wonderful evening and an intellectual highlight of the academic year for us at Boston University. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished colleague and speaker, Professor Barbara Diefendorf of the Boston University Department of History and the College of Arts and Sciences, who will be our lecturer this evening. Let me tell you a bit about our distinguished speaker. Professor Diefendorf completed her undergraduate studies at the University of California at Berkeley in 1968, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and with majors in French and history. She went on to earn her master's degree in history and her PhD from UCal Berkeley as well. She first took a post as an assistant professor in the humanities program at the University of New Hampshire, and then in 1980 joined the Boston University Department of History. Since then, she's been an active member of her department, has taught both graduate and undergraduate courses in the College of Arts and Sciences. In 2000, she received the Boston University College of Arts and Sciences Honors Program Award for Outstanding Teaching. Professor Diefendorf's research and scholarship include the social, political, and cultural history of early modern Europe, 16th and 17th century French history of the family and women and gender. She has authored several books, numerous chapters, and articles. I would like to mention her most recent book, From Penitence to Charity, Pious Women in the Catholic Reformation in Paris, which last year won the American Historical Association's J. Russell Major Prize for Best Book in English in French History. She has served on the board of editors of the Journal of the French Historical Studies and is past vice president of the Society for French Historical Studies. Professor Diefendorf has also been the recipient of many prestigious fellowships, including the National Endowment of the Humanities, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. For her lecture this evening, she has selected the title, Bloody Wedding, the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre in History and Memory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Barbara Diefendorf.
Thank you, President Brown, Provost Campbell, and the staff of the Provost Office who've helped me with all the details, and thank you all for being here. My colleagues, my students, past and present, friends from as long ago as junior high school. It's kind of amazing. I want, before I begin, actually also to make one more thank you that I don't often get to make, and that's to introduce my husband, Jeff Diefendorf, who's there in the fourth row. I met Jeff in my first class in graduate school, so he's been with me for the duration. And at that time, I couldn't imagine even completing a PhD, much less going on to a professional career, if it had not been for the confidence that he had from the beginning that I could and should be a historian, but also that I could do just about anything I set my mind to. I wouldn't be here tonight. So enough about my wedding. It's on to the wedding I'm supposed to be talking about and to the blood. In August 1572, French aristocrats gathered in Paris for a royal wedding. Amid a week of splendid festivities, the king's sister, Marguerite of Valois, was joined in marriage to Henry of Bourbon, King of Navarre, in front of Notre Dame Cathedral as crowds of Parisians gathered to watch. The marriage was not a love match, but a dynastic alliance intended to cement the peace between Catholic and Protestant factions in France after a decade of civil and religious war. It failed miserably at this purpose. Within a week of the ceremony, thousands of French Protestants, including many of the wedding guests, lay dead. The killing continued and spread beyond the capital, claiming an estimated 5,000 minimum victims and prompting a new round of civil wars that lasted a quarter of a century. These events are known collectively as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre because the killing began on the day dedicated to that saint in the Catholic calendar. They remain controversial. The king himself claimed to have given the order for the murders, and many believed them plotted in advance. This charge is implicit in the tag Blood Wedding that I've taken for my title. And it's the consequences of these events, the historical legends that have grown up around them, that I've chosen as my subject tonight. My interest in St. Bartholomew's Day began 25 years ago, just about the time I came to Boston University. No, there's no connection. My scholarship has been interwoven with my university life. I started research on the origins of the massacre with a summer research grant for new faculty, just in case anyone would like to think about starting them up again. Continued the project as one of the first members of the Society of Humanities Fellows, and submitted the book that came up out of this research as part of my dossier for promotion to the rank of professor. I moved on to other problems, but returned to the subject a few years ago when invited to do a documentary history for the Bedford series in History and Culture on the massacre. And in many respects, this book, which I'm just finishing, is the product of my career as a teacher. It reflects the importance I place on getting students to read and analyze primary sources, to engage critically with conflicting historical interpretations, and, most relevant here, to understand the myth-making power of history. In this lecture, then, I want to trace the evolution of public depictions of St. Bartholomew's Day with special attention to portrayals of King Charles IX, the king who claimed responsibility for the killings, so as to examine the changing relationship of French people to their past. Now, for Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers, St. Bartholomew's Day epitomized the dangers of religious fanaticism and intolerance. And today, the massacre is primarily associated with the horrors of religious war. And yet, if we take a longer view of these events, we'll see that historically, the dominant theme and representation of the massacre has been royal treachery and not religious hatreds. It has been interpreted largely in terms of politics and not religious beliefs. Why this was the case is my principal question. Why, until quite recently, when problems of religious persecution have become subjects of global concern, have representations of St. Bartholomew's Day largely ignored the problem of popular participation in the killing to give us instead simple caricatures of Catherine de' Medici, the wicked queen said to have plotted the murders, and Charles IX, the anti-king, said to have delighted in the slaughter of his subjects. I will focus on Charles because the answer to the question of why Catherine is almost too simple. She was a woman and a foreigner and an Italian at that. How much easier to blame the Queen Mother as a Machiavellian schemer, totally lacking in morality, instead of analyzing why these events took place. King Charles IX, who was just 22 when the massacres occurred, is the more challenging subject. Why is the lasting image of Charles not the recalcitrant consent most historians believe was wrung out of him by his council, but rather this imagined scene of the king standing in the window of the Louvre, preparing to fire down on his fleeing subjects. Now, before I can talk about myths of the massacre, I need to say something more about the historical context in which these events occurred. Unless you're a student in my Reformation class, you don't have any reason to keep the events of the 16th century in your head. So let me go back, however briefly, to the division of Western Christendom prompted by the Protestant Reformation. Without this schism, the hatreds intrinsic to the St. Bartholomew's Day killings would not have existed. There is no quiz. Now, Martin Luther did not intend to divide Christendom when he challenged the sale of indulgences in 1517. He wanted only to reform a practice that he believed harmful to the spiritual health of Christian believers. But the sale of indulgences was profitable to the church, which naturally fought back. So did Luther, who became more radical as he sought to defend himself. During the 4 years that separated Luther's initial attack on indulgences from his condemnation by both Pope and Emperor, he preached and wrote prolifically. Treatises and polemics streamed from his pen and were published, translated, and distributed across Europe. Political circumstances in Germany allowed Luther to escape execution for heresy, and his followers began to implement his ideas. In the more centralized Kingdom of France, by contrast, the crown was able, if not to eliminate Luther's ideas, at least to drive them underground. The theology faculty of the University of Paris formally condemned Luther's teaching as early as 1521, and France burned its first so-called Lutheran heretic in 1523. And yet the new ideas continued to spread, especially among university students and faculty. John Calvin was one of those student converts. Hard to imagine him back being a student, but he was. And when persecution made France too dangerous for him and his friends, they fled to safer ground. Calvin landed in Geneva, where he was soon invited to take direction of the Reformation in progress. Organizing the new church and elaborating a systematic Reformed theology took a lot of Calvin's energy during the years that followed, but he never lost sight of his desire of converting his native France to the new ideas. And to this end, he did a lot of things, but they included smuggling trained ministers over the border back into France, with the result that when French converts were ready to form churches of their own, it was Calvin's theology and the organizational structures of the Genevan church that were adopted in France. Now, during this period, France's king, Henry II, was distracted by wars with Germany and Spain, and unable to give as much attention to eliminating heresy as he would have liked. Negotiating peace, he returned home with this intention in 1559, but a jousting accident at the festivities intended to celebrate the peace cost the king his life. I want to explain one thing here also. That's Henry there, but I also have Henry IV here. When Henry dies, his wife, Catherine de' Medici, serves really for her 3 young kings who come to the throne successively after him. Each of them dies without children. Henry IV, who comes to the throne in 1610, is the same Henry of Navarre whose wedding is celebrated in 1572. But the important thing is that he comes to the throne not because he was lucky enough to marry the king's daughter, but because he comes from the line of Bourbon princes who are themselves descended from the kings of France. So he comes, you can't come to the throne of France through the female line. It is because when this line, the Valois line, dies out, that he founds then the next line of French kings. And again, that will be important later. In the meantime, though, Henry II is killed accidentally in 1559. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, struggles then to hold things together because factional rivalries are let loose at court by the death of the king. She struggles to maintain control for her young sons as an ultra-Catholic faction headed by the Guise family fights for control with a Protestant-leaning faction headed by members of the House of Bourbon, who are princes of the royal blood. And Antoine, that one first. Antoine is actually the father of Henry IV. He flirts with Protestantism, goes back into the Catholic fold, and it's the Prince of Condé who really leads things. But the point is, anyway, that during this time, the problems within the royal family are let loose, or the problems, with royal factionalism are let loose by the king's death. And as factions increase at court, they also increase in the streets. Reformed preaching becomes more public as ever larger crowds are gathered to Protestant sermons, and they become difficult to conceal. At the same time, the political opposition from ardent Catholics becomes more violent. Catholic extremists are preaching at this time that tolerating heresy will bring down the wrath of God. They liken heresy to gangrene or cancer and insist that it needs to be excised before the entire social body falls ill. Frightened by the popular animosity, Protestants take to attending services in arms. Catholic crowds respond by pelting them with stones and, on occasion, by burning down the places they are known to meet. Catherine attempted to ease these tensions by granting Protestants freedom of conscience and limited rights to worship. The gesture was well-intentioned, but Catherine had misjudged both Protestants' determination to spread the word and zealous Catholics' conviction that heresy is an abomination that has to be extinguished. Popular violence continues to increase, and with it, battles at court. In March 1562, my time chart, civil war breaks out. Protestants, or Huguenots, as they had come to be known as, seized a number of widely scattered cities, and they held them against sieges mounted by Catholic armies. And this Huguenot tactic was a very efficient one, an effective one, because sieges were expensive. Contemporary warfare favored the defense, and even though the Protestants are a small minority, never more than 15% of the French population, the crown is forced to negotiate a compromise peace. In 1563, the First War is ended with a peace that reaffirms the right to limited freedom of conscience and full freedom of conscience and limited rights to worship, the same as had been granted the year before. The peace wasn't lasting because it failed to resolve the underlying problems on each side. Protestants still wanted to extend these limited rights to worship, and zealous Catholics still wanted entirely to eliminate the new faith. 8 wars were fought before a more durable peace was negotiated with the Edict of Nantes in 1598. Ironically, tragically, the Edict of Nantes allowed much the same sort of limited toleration for Protestants within a Catholic France that Catherine de' Medici had granted before the First War. It's hard to escape the impression that 35 years of bitter civil war had ended in a return to the status quo ante. But I get ahead of myself here. At the time of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 3 wars had taken place, and there was hope that the peace would hold. Still, there were warning signs, including continued popular unrest. Riots broke out in Paris, a predominantly Catholic city, in December 1571, when city officials attempted to remove a monument commemorating the execution of 3 Huguenots for heresy. Moreover, rivalries at court were still intense, although the leaders of each faction had changed because of deaths in the previous wars. In particular, Henry, Duke of Guise, the Catholic leader, the son of the previous Catholic leader who had been killed at the end of the First War, hated Admiral Coligny because he blamed him for his father's death. Catherine de' Medici is said also to have hated Coligny, who was gaining quite an ascendancy over her young son, Charles IX. And Charles, at 22, was just beginning to be independent of his mother's direction. These hatreds probably played a part in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, but a direct causal effect has never been proved because no one has ever conclusively demonstrated whether it was Catherine or the Duke of Guise, or perhaps someone else entirely, whose attempt to assassinate Coligny touched off all of the events of the massacre. Now, what we do know is this. On the 22nd of August, 1572, an unknown assailant took a shot at Coligny. Excuse me, I should have shown you the picture of Charles IX there, but anyway, on to the massacre itself. An unknown assailant took a shot at Coligny And this is illustrated, this is in a style that medievalists will recognize, simultaneous narration, so that we see different parts of the story. But here's Coligny being shot at as he returns from a meeting with the king at the Louvre. The shot did not kill him, it wounded him, but it had very grave consequences just the same. Huguenot leaders believed that the Duke of Guise was responsible for the assassination attempt, and they demanded justice. The crown promised an inquest, but before it could take place, rumors began to spread that the angry Huguenots, not content to wait for royal justice, planned to take matters into their own hands. They intended, or so the rumor went, to seize the royal family and effect a political coup. Now, historians sympathetic to the Protestants tended to scoff at the idea of a Huguenot plot. It would have been foolhardy, they claim, for members of this minority faith to attempt to seize the king, not only within his well-defended castle, but also within the walls of his overwhelmingly Catholic capital. I would argue, however, that there did not actually have to be a Huguenot plot as long as the French Catholics believed one was in the making. And the idea was not at all far-fetched. In fact, the Protestants had attempted to seize the previous king, Francis II, so as to rescue him from his Catholic advisors in 1560. They had also made a previous attempt to capture Charles IX when he was out hunting outside of Paris in 1567, an act that touched off the Second Religious War. So the notion that they might try again was eminently credible to the Catholic audience at this time, both, I believe, at court and in the city. And this, I'm convinced, is what prompted the king, after a late-night meeting with advisors in the Louvre, to order a coordinated attack on Coligny and the rest of the Huguenot leadership on the eve of the 24th of August. And here we see, these are Guise's men at the door. This is Coligny's lodgings, and you can barely see him. It's a little bit cut off there, but see him in his bed. He's killed in his bed. His body's tossed out the window to the waiting crowds below. Simultaneously then, although it actually happened afterwards, you see the popular killings, the murders throughout the city. Noise made by the troops participating in the murders, I think, is extremely important because, to my mind, this is what touched off the wave of civilian deaths in the excitable city. In other words, I don't believe that the king ever said to kill everyone, that his intention, and I'm not excusing it, but there is a difference, I think, to execute the military leadership as an order or to simply slaughter all of the Protestants. And that's something that's gotten lost in a lot of histories of St. Bartholomew's Day. What they heard was the Duke of Guise, who we know did take charge of the execution of Coligny, and then led troops through the city, and he's said to have called out, kill them all, it is the king's command." Guise's words, which I believe were intended to encourage his troops to carry out their already grisly orders to execute the Huguenot leadership, but they were taken by the Catholic populace to authorize, indeed to order, the execution of the Huguenot population, who were already hated as heretics and rebels against the crown. Now, if you look closely at this scene, you will see that the massacres here are being carried out all by men wearing high-crowned helmets. These mark them out as the liveried servants or liveried soldiers serving the king, the Duke of Guise, and other Catholic leaders. This is inaccurate, but telling. Many, if not most, of the deaths were the result of popular violence. But the Protestant artist here wanted to depict, either because this is how he heard the story, we don't have any reason to think he was actually there, it was done by a German, but he wanted to depict the killings because he believed them to be officially sanctioned and deliberate treachery and not the accidental result of crowds that got out of control. The sense of treachery is heightened by such scenes as these women who are begging for their children's life. They're a little hard to see here, but that's what's going on there. And of course, here, people stripping bodies dead and throwing them into a river already running with bodies and blood. So the question then, having already said that I don't believe the king ordered the massacre, why is it so confusing? Why do people believe he did? Well, Charles himself contributed to that because he told contradictory stories on every side. To Protestant audiences, he insisted, initially at least, that the whole thing was the unfortunate result of a popular uprising organized by the Duke of Guise. Charles sent quite different letters, however, to Catholic powers. To them, he gave the same explanation that he offered to the Catholic magistrates of his parliament and a public appearance 2 days after the killing began. That which was done, declared the king, was by his express commandment to prevent a most detestable and cursed conspiracy begun by the admiral and his adherents and accomplices. So to the Protestants, he blames the Catholics, to the Catholics, the Protestants. And these contradictory expressions to us say just one thing. The king was willing to say whatever he thought people wanted to hear. If he took credit for the massacre in Catholic circles, this is because a great many Catholics at home and abroad applauded the coup. Some did not. The massacre divided Catholics and pushed moderates to seek new avenues to peace on the ground that the religious hatreds were exacting too high a price. Others, however, openly expressed their joy. As one Swiss monk studying in Paris wrote back to his abbot at St. Gallen, everyone agrees in praising the prudence and magnanimity of the king, who, after having by his goodness and indulgence fattened up, so to speak, the heretics like cattle, suddenly had their throats slit by his soldiers. And support was not just expressed privately. Catholic powers sent congratulatory letters, and celebratory masses were sung at the Spanish court and in Rome. Gregory XIII, recently elected as Pope, also commissioned 2 more permanent commemorations of the massacre. The first is this medal. Oops, I'm sorry, I was supposed to show you those images also of the king and Catherine. And there's the medal. I'll come back to one of those images later in any event. This medal commemorating the extirpation of the Huguenots with a bust of the Pope on one side and an avenging angel, sword in hand, standing before a pile of dead and cowering victims. Similar in content, but not in scale, are these frescoes painted by Giorgio Vasari. This is the first of 3 for the Sala Regia in the Vatican Palace. And this is the room where the Pope received ambassadors and kings. It stands right next to the Sistine Chapel, and I understand that these paintings are still there. This is Coligny being carried off injured, but that room is not normally open to visitors today, so they don't have to explain these scenes. This scene, which once again we have Coligny being tossed out the window, his body to be checked on below. But what I find particularly interesting here in Vasari's depiction, if you look at the Protestants who are being killed, they're depicted with bestial faces, ugliness, and grimaces that make them almost complicitous in their own murders. They look like people who deserve to be killed. And here in the foreground, the victim, initially in the foreground, is raising a sword, making it look like this was a fair fight with people on both sides, instead of, as it was, in fact, the murder of Huguenots in their beds. Now, these Vatican frescoes are unique. Nothing of the kind, fortunately, nothing of the kind was created in France, where the renewal of war with the Huguenots necessitated a more subdued response. Nevertheless, the king did celebrate the triumph by having 2 medals struck. This is the first of them, showing very much the same scene as that last Vatican panel. Here's Charles appearing before Parliament, symbolically raising the sword of justice. Under his feet are the slain bodies of the Huguenot leaders. The second medal shows Charles wreathed in laurel, the victor's laurel, with an inscription calling him the tamer of rebels. And on the other side, the obverse side, Hercules is slaying the many-headed hydra of heresy. The small size of the medals kept the message discreet, but the self-satisfaction, this image of the king as Hercules, is clear. Praise for the king's role in St. Bartholomew's Day was, however, short-lived, and Protestant writers, of course, took the opposite point of view from the start. They cleverly co-opted the first Catholic account of the massacre, something published in Rome just 2 months after St. Bartholomew's Day, and they reversed the author's original intent, which was to celebrate Charles's clever strategy in luring the Protestants to Paris so that they could be killed. The Protestants turned this around and used it as evidence of premeditation. They used this as just the first of a number of treatises and tracts that came out afterwards, justifying the rebellion against the crown, because they did go to war after St. Bartholomew's Day, and also advancing a political theory of resistance to tyranny. Now, prior to St. Bartholomew's Day, the Huguenots had tried to deny, or at least to play down, any accusations of rebellion against the crown. Even after they failed to seize Charles IX and touched off the Second Religious War in 1567, they persisted in saying that they opposed the king's evil advisors, but not the king himself. Once Charles had claimed responsibility for St. Bartholomew's Day, such proclamations of loyalty were no longer tenable. And forced to articulate a new rationale for going to war, Huguenot spokesmen contended that resistance to royal authority was justified when the king violated the implicit pact between ruler and ruled. And this right of resistance was elaborated in cautiously worded legal treatises then used by Locke and others more familiarly in 17th century Britain, but they were also advanced in a more direct fashion in polemics like the wake-up call to the French and their neighbors, which justified the Huguenots' revolt in the explicit context of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This is totally uninteresting as a book, except for the fact that it was not published in Edinburgh. It was published in Strasbourg and smuggled into France. It's quickly printed, and all of the simplicity and ugliness of it is because it's clandestine literature of the time, not accepted in France, but spread there and elsewhere in Europe, because it was aimed also at a European audience. So published in 1574, then, the wake-up call is, to my knowledge at least, the first account of the massacre to include the story of Charles taking a gun in his hands and firing on frightened Huguenots from the window of the Louvre. The incident is recounted, moreover, in a context that makes it particularly damning for the king. The author tells how Protestant nobles, lodged in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, so directly across from the Louvre, actually received word of the killing in time to escape. But they couldn't believe that the king had ordered this, and in fact believed that he must himself be being held captive. And so they decide to go again across the Louvre and to try to rescue the king. But no sooner do they start out than they discover that troops are heading directly at them, and that the king is standing in a window of the Louvre looking down at them and urging his men on. Although, in fact, the author adds that he's even heard that the king himself took up a hunting musket and cried out, let us shoot, for God's sake, they are fleeing." Now, the story is recounted here as rumor, something the author has been told, but it soon appears as established fact in other Protestant narratives. Recounting the massacre as a tale of Charles IX's treachery was only one of several ways the story of St. Bartholomew's Day could be used to gain support for the Protestant cause at home and abroad. And in the printed version that will be handed out at the end, I also explain how Catherine de' Medici could be blamed and the Duke of Guise could be blamed, and the Protestants could twist this to their advantage, but I had to cut that for the presentation tonight so as not to try your patience unduly. But I'd be happy to answer questions if anyone wants to get into those alternatives. I'm also forced to abbreviate what I'd like to say about how Protestant accounts of the massacre served religious ends in order to stick to my narrative on Charles IX. But it's important to say that in addition to justifying the Huguenot rebellion, they also memorialized the massacre's victims in edifying narratives of triumphant faith that were published as martyrologies and were brought out again. They became integral to French Protestants' identity. They offered strength and consolation when persecutions picked up again in the 17th century, especially after Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, thereby forcing the Huguenots to convert, to flee France under threat of arrest, or to practice their faith only in secret. And even after French Protestants finally regained their civil rights, just on the eve of the Revolution, memories of their suffering permeated their sense of collective identity. On the Catholic side, Catholic narratives also incorporated elements of divine will, only different ones, of course, for they interpreted the massacre as a sign of God's hatred of heresy, that he permitted and allowed such a thing. But Catholics also, and more surprisingly, took up the Huguenots' criticism of the Valois monarchy that appeared to have authorized the murders. The avenging angels and Hercules metaphors that appeared in the first reactions disappear, but Catholics begin to take up more measured echoes of the Crown's own claim that the murders were a necessary response to a planned Huguenot coup. These first accounts play down then any direct involvement on the part of the king, and seldom mention the popular murders, but if they do, they mention them as the unfortunate work of an always unruly populace. At the same time, they counter the Protestants' resistance theory by insisting on the need for order and the fact that this can only be found in church and king. So for the moment, they're absolutists and the others are constitutionalists posing resistance. When Protestant Henry of Navarre inherits legally the French throne on Henry III's death in 1589, the position staked out by Protestants as proponents of resistance to tyranny and Catholics as defenders of order and obedience to authority briefly reverse themselves, with Catholics taking up the radical resistance theory of the Holy League and Protestants defending royal authority and absolutism. These quarrels subside once Henry IV converts to Catholicism and restores peace in the kingdom. But the important thing here for me is that the evocation of Charles IX as a tyrant king survives and even grows in importance as the negative image with which Henry IV and subsequent Bourbon kings can be compared. Henry's publicists work hard to erase the memory of the years he spent as the leader of the Huguenot opposition by portraying his advent to the French throne as a result of God's plan to rescue France from the miseries of civil war by restoring good government through his person. And Henry's propaganda machine succeeds so well that when he dies in 1610, he is mourned everywhere as Henry the Great, and he is still today France's favorite king. The legend of divine sanction spun out by his publicists becomes a key pillar in his Bourbon descendants' claim to rule by divine right. But where Henry's publicists only implicitly compared him to the weak Valois kings who preceded him, historians in the employ of his grandson, Louis XIV, made the comparison explicit by using Charles IX as an object lesson in bad kingship, depicting him as badly educated, badly raised, corrupted by his foreign mother and her decadent court. They made of him the very antithesis of the Bourbon kings who bring peace and good order to the troubled kingdom. And this lesson is driven home by offering legend as truth. Charles IX's reluctant consent to the massacre made him look weak, but not tyrannical. The more damaging image is that of the king personally firing on the Huguenots. And even Jacques-Bénigne Bossuet, the arch-theorist of Louis XIV's absolutism, has no problem incorporating this story into his history of France. That this was at best hearsay has been lost from view. Nor was the truth recovered by Enlightenment philosophes who failed to challenge the legend despite their avowed intention of questioning all received wisdom, because it served so well as a denunciation of intolerance and abuse of authority. In his Ariade, an epic poem about Henry IV, much loved in the 18th century, Voltaire bemoans the crime and shame of the king, that is to say Charles IX, who had soiled his sacred hands in spilling the blood of his subjects. And he even adds a footnote in which he claims to have heard this story from a man who heard the story from the man who loaded Charles's gun. More hearsay, but never mind. By the French Revolution, Charles IX's complicity in the bloodshed on St. Bartholomew's Day was an accepted fact and a useful weapon against the Ancien Regime. The great orator Mirabeau, discoursing on freedom of conscience in the National Assembly, is said to have gestured toward the window in the neighboring Louvre, where a French king, armed against his own subjects by detestable factions, shot the musket that gave the signal for St. Bartholomew's Day. And several years later, during the Revolution's most radical phase, journalist Jean-Paul Marat justified the popular violence then occurring in Paris with an explicit comparison to St. Bartholomew's Day. What, he asked, are the few drops of blood that the populace has spilled in the current revolution compared with the torrents that the mystical frenzy of a Charles IX caused to be spread? Is it any wonder, then, that the story features prominently in Alexandre Dumas' romantic novel, Queen Margot, which features a dramatic scene in which Charles IX fires furiously at the Huguenots because Henry of Navarre has refused his choice of death, the Mass, or the Bastille. And rebuffed by Henry, Charles picks up the musket and blandishes it in a wild rage. This passage deserves to be quoted at length. Uttering a hoarse kind of growl, Charles turned toward the window and aimed at a man who was running along the quay in front. "I must kill someone," cried Charles IX, ghastly as a corpse, his eyes injected with blood, and firing as he spoke, he struck the man who was running. Henry uttered a groan. Then, animated by a frightful ardor, Charles loaded and fired his musket without cessation, uttering cries of joy every time his aim was successful. Now, the fictional placement here of the calm and resolute Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV, next to the frenzied Charles IX, underscores, I would argue, the contrast between good kingship and bad already developed in the old regime. The image remained relevant to 19th century political debates, and it remained so precisely because questions of kingship remained central to these debates. It could be used, for example, by Orleanists in the Revolution of 1830 to justify replacing the bad king, Charles X, with a good king, Louis Philippe. But at the same time, Republicans, including popular historian Jules Michelet, could use this image of a king mad with rage to denounce any form of monarchy because it risked placing power into the hands of an unbalanced king. However common it became in popular literature and histories, the image of Charles IX firing on his subjects did not entirely escape critical scrutiny. In 1857, the Society for the History of French Protestantism reprinted several articles that debated whether the incident had actually taken place. Those who said no offered three key arguments. First, that the window from which Charles allegedly fired did not exist in 1572. It was part of a later edition. Second, that the sort of hunting gun, the arquebuse de chasse, that Charles was said to have fired did not have the range required to accurately hit a target on the other side of the Seine. And third, that Charles, who was an avid hunter, would have known this and would not have risked hitting the Catholic guards who pursued the Huguenots instead of his actual target. Now, the authors also offered counter-arguments. Even if that window didn't exist, he could have used another window, and so forth. But to anyone who doesn't have a stake in the argument, it seems pretty clear. Whatever window Charles stood in, he could not have fired across the Seine at that time with the weaponry available to him, and he would have known better than to try. But even beyond the physical impossibility of the event, the king's psychology appears all wrong. The action is out of character with everything we know about Charles IX. Some historical accounts suggest that he became morose, depressed, regretful after the massacre, but none of the evidence suggests that the king was crazed before, during, or after these events. This was the product of legend, of romantic novelists and historians like Michelet, feeding on the most rabidly partisan accounts of 16th century polemicists. The partisanship did wane a bit by the end of the 19th century, but meanwhile, however, Coligny's role evolved as well, as is evident from this monument to the admiral placed near the site of his murder in 1889. It is now squeezed between T-shirt shops and souvenir shops on the Rue de Rivoli, directly across from the Louvre. You may well have walked past it and never noticed it. Coligny's statue is easily overlooked, and yet this is the only public monument to St. Bartholomew's Day. It was funded by public subscription, begun in 1887. That is the 100th anniversary of when the French Protestants got their full civil rights in 1787, and erected 2 years later in time for the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Now, this was a difficult time in French history. The 100 years after the Revolution. Revolution was too, but it's just in case my antecedent's missing there. The triumph of secularism in the Third Republic was not yet assured, and quarrels between pro-Catholic monarchists and secular Republicans are still seething. To diffuse the partisanship and religious tensions that lay very near the surface of the French politics, it was important to depict Coligny as a patriot, a man who could be honored by all French people, and not just as a martyr for his faith. And thus we see here religion on the right, but also patrie, country, on the left. Religion is veiled and carries a martyr's palm. Patrie is helmeted and carries a victor's wreath. Interesting, considering that he was, in fact, a rebel, though he fought in wars for the crown before that. The inscription at the base of the monument also joins both themes. It's a quotation from Coligny's will, and it says, "I will willingly forget all things, whether insults or injuries, that touch only my person, provided that those that touch upon the glory of God and the public peace can be safeguarded." These words spoke in two registers, sufficiently innocuous to arouse little opposition from French Catholics. They nevertheless reaffirmed to French Protestants, and they did dominate the committee that raised funds to build the monument. They spoke to them of the just cause of their Huguenot ancestors in taking up arms to defend their faith. In fact, a different inscription was originally planned, the same sentence from Montesquieu that now appears on a marble plaque alongside the monument, identifying Coligny for visitors who do not know their history. It says, roughly translated, "Coligny was assassinated, having nothing in his heart except the glory of the state." Were these words, I wonder, too neutral, too secular for Protestant committee members who saw the monument as reparation for past wrongs? I found no explanation for the shift, and yet I think it is significant that both inscriptions commemorate Coligny as a patriot who had his country's best interests at heart. We do not raise monuments to rebels, not unless we've decided that their cause was just. And Charles IX could be remembered as a wicked king or merely as a weak one, but it was necessary to depict Coligny as a faithful servant of the crown if he was to serve as a national and not merely a partisan hero. Such are the needs of memory. That St. Bartholomew's Day remains a sensitive spot in French Protestant consciousness was made evident yet again less than a decade ago, when the Vatican announced that Pope John Paul II would close the Catholics' World Youth Days, which were going to be held in Paris in August 1997, with an open-air mass on the 24th of August. French Protestants responded angrily. They did not contend that this date, the 425th anniversary of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, was chosen deliberately. That, they admitted, would be to turn the clock back too many years. But they were dismayed that the date's historic significance had been so blithely ignored. And they called on the Pope to explicitly invoke the memory of the tragedy of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And they also seized the occasion to sound a broader call for interfaith dialogue in asking that memory of the massacre be joined with evocation of the current dramas in Ireland, Algeria, and other countries that were largely due to religious or ethnic intolerance. This call for interfaith dialogue is refreshing in a history too filled with prejudice and the clash of faiths. Even in our own country, St. Bartholomew's Day has been evoked in blatantly partisan and anti-Catholic fashion, as it is in this 1927 handbill distributed by the Ku Klux Klan and given to me by one of my colleagues in American history. Or, for a more contemporary example, on this website posted by the respectable-sounding Reformation.org, which narrates the massacre as a Jesuit-inspired plot and then culminates in this image of Charlton Heston raising a rifle. What's the connection, you might ask? It's a good question. According to the site's creators, neither the massacre nor any of the Huguenots' other persecutions would have taken place if only they had had guns. An armed citizenry in France would have prevented this tragedy from ever happening. I had to laugh because, of course, the Huguenots did have guns, although it's a little hard to sleep with a 16th century arquebuse under your pillow, or to fire it on short notice even. But But the anti-Catholic screed here is not funny. I mean, this part of it is amusing, and you can ignore the link to the NRA website, but the virulent anti-Catholicism of Reformation.org is no laughing matter. And the site shows that religious hatreds have, alas, not been vanquished, even within the Christian fold. They are, however, only a part, and I would hope an aberrant part, of the St. Bartholomew's Day legacy. There are other, I believe, richer lessons that the massacre can teach us. First and most obviously, that suffering has a long memory. These events have retained far greater importance for French Protestants, whose history of persecution has kept their collective memory alive to emotionally charged recollections of martyrdom than they do for French Catholics, who, as members of the majority faith, have found it far easier to bury the religious dimension of the massacre under colorful anecdotes about wicked queens and murderous kings, thereby relegating these events to a distant past to which they feel no personal connection. At the same time, I hope I have shown, the polemical distortions of the St. Bartholomew's Day story do not just divide along lines of religious affiliation. With the exception of the kind of blatant hate literature that I've just shown you, both Protestant and Catholic commentators have tended to play down the religious dimension of the massacre, and especially the hatreds expressed in the popular murders, so as to focus instead on its political dimensions. Protestants acknowledged these hatreds when they were writing a narrative of suffering in their martyrologies, but they give them very little place in the polemical works, the numerous works that sought to justify the rebellion, because here they needed to represent the killings as the deliberate result of official policy and not as the accidental result of popular passions. Catholics, on the other hand, were embarrassed by the religious hatred stirred up by radical clerics and preferred to cast the massacre as a necessary act of state. The reasoning was different, but the results the same. Deflecting attention away from popular religious violence, they focused instead on the question of who was to blame. In doing so, they inevitably influenced subsequent attempts to understand both participants and events. And once we recognize, then, the primacy of politics in accounts of the massacre, we need to go on to ask what political purposes are served by either blaming Charles IX or exonerating him. When we do, we find that the narrative of royal responsibility could be manipulated to at least three distinct and contradictory ends. It could be used to defend the king's exercise of authority as necessary and therefore just, or to condemn it as tyrannical, a reason for limiting the power of kings, or it could be used as a wholesale attack against monarchy on the ground that no king could be just and all kings were potential tyrants. These different interpretive narratives were picked up and abandoned in consonance with changing political needs. A century after a Protestant publicist first used the image of Charles IX firing furiously on fleeing Huguenots to justify his party's rebellion, the Catholic arch-absolutist Bossuet used it to promote the Bourbon dynasty by contrasting their founder to his degenerate Valois predecessors. And a century after that, ardent revolutionaries used it to attack the very institution of monarchy as inherently prone to corruption and excess. There is also a more universal lesson here. Historical narratives can be made to serve diametrically opposed ideas or ends. Time blurs the line between polemic and history, and anecdotes originally intended as deliberate character assassination can later be retailed as unquestioned truths. No narrative is innocent, no source transparent. The more fantastic stories may persist only in the popular media, including now on the web, but the danger exists for serious scholarship as well. There are many things we will never know about St. Bartholomew's Day, including just what was decided and by whom in secret meetings in the Louvre. And as a card-carrying historian, this makes me cautious, but it does not make me despair. If anything, it reaffirms my faith in the value of historical analysis. Although there are things we cannot know, many accumulated myths can be cleared away. And if we cannot know who gave the original order for the massacre, we can nevertheless know a lot about how these events have been subsequently interpreted and what purposes they have been made to serve. And maybe in the end, that is more important. Thank you.
Professor Diefendorf would take some questions if there are some from the audience. Gene?
Thank you. Enjoyed your talk. My question is, if you've analyzed to some degree the role that the hatred that was presumably built up prior to the massacre played in not in triggering it, which you talked a lot about, but in sustaining it, as it were, and in particular, whether you speculate any analogs with, let's say, the hatred in the former Yugoslavia that led to the massacres there in recent times, or is going on today in other parts of the world, which we know about.
It's always dangerous getting off the ground that I know. I think there are common denominators, and that the common denominator essentially comes to be when you are so convinced of your own absolute truth, of your faith, that you speak for God, and this is what God wants, and then you can depersonalize others and essentially write them off, say that God, it's all right to treat them this way because God wants them punished. And those, I think, of when we get to the religious basis, obviously every set of events has its own combination of religion and politics, and that's why I hesitate to speak outside of my context. I was originally intrigued by the massacres at a time when we were really shifting and just becoming conscious of the religious dimensions, even of things like the Middle Eastern conflicts and Ireland. At a time in the 80s, they were mostly written off as more political than religious. And so I became intrigued by the study of France, where these were first-generation conflicts, first-generation converts, and we could take things back to a point and say there were really brothers fighting, and we didn't have to figure in all of the socioeconomics. I realize it's never that simple, but there are common denominators certainly in what carries it on. If you look at the massacres, you also see religion still being acted out in them. There are many incidents of cases of trying to convert people in the streets, of making them get down on their knees and, say the Hail Mary or something. So even in the bloodiest part of the massacre, there's some religious dimension to it.
Yes.
Is there a special consciousness among French people, Protestant French people, that doesn't exist, let's say, in other countries in Europe just due to that particular history, in the sense that if a Protestant would meet another Protestant, they would feel already a type of kinship? Is that the case, not the case?
I think French Protestants still feel themselves very much a separate people. It was something I didn't understand the first time I went to France, my junior year abroad. I was invited to spend every week to go visit a Protestant family, and they went to separate schools, and they told me about their past, and I really didn't understand it until I became a historian, quite how separate and isolated from French society they felt. So my sense is that, yes, there is very much a separate sense of identity and a sense that France, although a very secular and lay society now, is still fundamentally not partly their religion, that it is different.
Yes. Make an excellent case that Charles was not the crazed murderer that victims made him out to be, and that there was more popular uprising. But I'm curious about the ties between politics and the uprising. In England, in the 16th century, several popular rebellions, uprisings of the commons, have been reinterpreted as being court-controlled, that they were unleashed when it was appropriate to unleash them. And I'm wondering whether there are examples in the 16th century French history that have previously been seen as popular uprisings that have now been better understood as court-controlled.
I don't know of any, although there are some people, one of the arguments about the Duke of Guise being responsible for this would have Guise as essentially acting in the name of the king, as trying to seize power from the king, organizing the uprising, and then Charles claiming credit at the end for fear of that the Duke of Guise was otherwise going to seize the throne. So not the king himself, but a faction at court. There are people who would argue that. I disagree with them, although I did in the book that I wrote about this, the earlier book on it, I certainly do argue that within the militia, the civilian militia, there is a kind of runaway group within the militia that is probably organizing things and certainly ready to push everything farther. If you look at the arrest records for the arrests for heresy in the previous decade, it's the same names that come up over and over again as the men who are out there on the street arresting. And I suspect that this is another one of those common dimensions to violence everywhere, that you get bully boys that are out there that seize the opportunity to maybe be more than they would have been, whether it's a militia officer in their neighborhood or something. And so for them, the kind of personal motives where that meets religion, meets politics is hard to straighten out. But
Yes.
Excuse me. I too enjoyed your talk, Barbara. The French in recent years have been wont to identify crimes against humanity and then to criminalize any speech that denies these crimes. One thinks of the Holocaust, there's a law against denying it, and of course more recently the attempts to criminalize denials of the Armenian genocide by the Turks. Has there been any effort to do this with either of those things, with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and why not? The French are apt, that is to say, to wallow in their guilt. They seem to love it. That's what the Vichy syndrome is all about. So the answer cannot simply be that no, it would be too painful for the French. I mean, they've become a traumatophile people.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a good question, although I'm not aware of any reactions. I mean, I think the obvious place this would have come up is in 1997, the whole flap that came up when the Pope came and was going to say Mass on that day. But what people were doing mostly was, I had a feeling, standing and watching the dialogue between Protestants and Catholics. The Vatican did arrange for reconciliation services, ironically, or maybe it was deliberate, in the very church whose bells are supposed to have sounded the call for the massacre in Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. They invited Protestants to a service, but I wasn't able to follow anything that happened afterwards. I saw no accounts except that they were invited. Nothing seems to have come out of it. And the Pope's own speech, when he welcomed people on the 23rd of August, was very measured, in the words that, one sees behind that papal infallibility. We're not going to admit that we might have been wrong on this, but he's just calling for dialogue in the future and reconciliation as somewhere down the road to be aimed for. But that, again, that's between the papacy and the people, and I didn't see much, again, as I say, it was almost a voyeuristic sort of sense of secular French looking on with amusement as all of this flap was happening around them.
Barbara, it's hard to imagine a more secular society and culture than France today, and a less religious society than France today, if you go by the polls on church membership. And this powerful tradition of secularism really came into its own in the 19th century under the Third Republic, and most of the leaders, and many of the leaders of that secularist movement were Protestants. And I wonder if you see any connection to that secularist trend in France that has given us what we have today, and the memory of massacres such as St. Bartholomew, but others during the religious wars.
Okay. Do I need to summarize that for the cameras, I'd completely forgotten, as I was supposed to, that you are there. But the question about French secularism and is there reference to the massacres? Yes, I mean, that to me is what's implicit here in the story of this monument. French fought hard for secularism, but it is and remains a very contested secularism, as you know. It's not taken for granted that it's a secular state. It is a fiercely secular, don't tread on this line state, and that is because they fought so hard about this in the 19th century. That is why this is still so touchy on all sides, no question.
In the back.
The Louis XIII and Cardinal de Richelieu and then Louis XIV, do you think that they seem to kind of go against the Huguenots, try to sort of, coming from the court, trying to extinguish their rights. So it seems that the subsequent monarchs were working to extinguish the Huguenots. Why, do you agree with that? And why would that not follow that Charles IX could have also been equal with them in sort of his bias?
Well, it's, I think, an unfortunate heritage for Henry IV that his son and grandson that did deny his fellow co-religionists their rights. For Louis XIII, he is convinced, in fact, that the problem is the power that the Huguenots have because they have been given, in order to protect their religious rights, they've been given a number of cities that they can hold militarily. And for Louis XIII, the question is really just to get rid of this political power. It's Louis XIV, and Louis XIII is a very strong Catholic. And Louis XIV even stronger. I think Louis XIV, it's really hard to explain, except that he becomes convinced, in fact, that Protestantism is not necessary and that as the Grand King, he doesn't need it. He's got very little sense of his heritage there. But, explaining Louis XIV is a little more complicated. But the problem is that religious hatreds did not really die down. You have in the 17th century, if you get away from the court, you have an avid Catholic Reformation with people going out and trying to convert the countrysides. And they managed to stimulate enough continued popular support for Catholicism that Louis, sitting in his castle at Versailles, can believe, in fact, that Protestants have been converted, that they're not important anymore, and that he can just declare it, this France an all-Catholic country.
Yes.
Again, a great talk. I was wondering, in terms of memory and the manipulation of memory, what role the state has today to play, that if these Protestants, descendants of Huguenots, go to their own schools. I wasn't too sure that these were religious schools. I mean, so does a topic such as this get into the school book, or is it forgotten by the Catholics?
Oh, no, it's written actually quite a bit. There's quite a bit written about St. Bartholomew's Day, Linda. In school books, though, the ones that I have looked at are a relatively simplistic account. Not much attention to how the massacre takes place, and little attention still to the popular violence in it. Still more, probably the kind of party line that is to say that the king may have done this, or maybe we don't need to worry, the bad Valois kings, we don't need to worry about them. There can be kind of scandalous, this happened, know about it. But there's little attempt to carry this through and almost no analysis of the religious hatreds behind it. That's what's still missing.
I want to share some experience. Actually, I was in a French classroom in 7th and 8th grade. And the story was related in a very, as you say, simplistic way, but also very alive. And this is what is my question, actually. After so many centuries, a French textbook and a French child, well, it was a long time that this was the case for me, but still not that long. There is King Henri IV, very much the good king, although he's a Protestant. Subsequent obliteration almost of Protestant population in France, a very successful Catholicism, and as was pointed out, secularism in France. At the same time, the Catholicism was something which was a matter of course. So it is, and at the end, despite all this, it is alive, the whole memory of it, as if it were yesterday. How would you comment on that? What is your perception?
That the past is still very present, but it's evoked very much in this kind of novelistic sense. As I said, for the Protestants, for French Catholics, St. Bartholomew's Day is something they feel no connection to. They can tell you the stories of Catherine de' Medici. They love, the films about this period, but it's no connection to their lives. It's only French Protestants, because of their history of persecution, who have carried it down in their lives. I'm not sure if that really addresses what your question is. Maybe I'm missing.
It does, definitely. And but I still have this impression, and I may be wrong on that and overstating something, that with a very strong nation state, history, although is much more important, and these rivalries remain more important, not in everyday life, not that they are going to be fanatical, but still as a tradition and as a potential danger, I would say. Or am I wrong completely?
Well, I'm not sure if the point is, they're definitely, the Catholic heritage is still there in a secular country, but if you're seeing that's the danger, I'm not sure that I would agree. I don't see that as dangerous, but certainly the mentality still is shaped by a history of Catholicism, no question.
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question on what you were saying about the lack of discussion of a popular role. Isn't some of that picked up, though, in the way in which St. Bartholomew's Day becomes a symbol for fanaticism? Because looking at, say, the German literature in the late 18th century, it's analyzed as an instant of Schwärmerei, of enthusiasm, of the spread of something through an entire population. And that's even how certain liberal German critics of the French Revolution start talking about it as being the same sort of fanatical spread with all these diseases of metaphors of fever and contagion, and that gets you very easily from the royal plot to the rest of to mass participation by the population.
But that is essentially the Enlightenment view of it. It really is the Enlightenment that gives us the notion of that it was religious fanaticism, that it is, as I guess it's Montesquieu who talks about everyone marching gaily off to war under the banner of their saints and condemns this. What surprised me when I started looking at the longer history is that seems to be such a brief moment, and then it goes back to the use of religion for politics. I had thought that the Enlightenment interpretation was really how we always saw it, and not as a kind of a separate thing in this longer history of political.
But it does come back in one really odd document that I was just looking at recently, and there's a letter from Arnold Schoenberg, the composer, in 1920, looking at the rise of anti-Jewish feeling in Germany. And he says, this looks like another St. Bartholomew's Day. I mean, that's his metaphor for it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the metaphor does come up frequently, but that's an interesting use.
One last question.
I was just wondering, on a more sort of the methodology of the history and examining the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when looking at the role of Catherine de' Medici, you'd mentioned that a lot of historians previously had sort of accepted almost this polemic against her as a woman, as an Italian, and then as a woman in power for her three sons. I was wondering if in recent historiography, which is expanded more upon women's roles within the early modern period, whether there's been a revision of Catherine, not just to dismiss these polemics, but to look at what she actually may have responded to when this happened.
Good question, Yola. There have been in the last year, two recent biographies of Catherine de' Medici by two French historians. Both of them take different views on Catherine's role in the massacre, although I was shocked to find in an email exchange with one of them who sent me his book, who thinks Catherine didn't have anything to do with it. It was all done by the Guise, and this is a new interpretation that Catherine and Charles had to take credit for it because the Guise would carry away. And I said, wrote him back, thank you for the book and interesting interpretation. And he said, well, Denis Crouzet was taking a different tack, so I thought I had to come up with one of my own. So, what can I say, But there have been some attempts to see Catherine anyway as a great mother figure. There's an art historian who's spent a lot of her career showing how Catherine used Ceres and other symbols of motherhood and all, trying to create the image of Catherine as a benign figure, and how she deliberately tried to create for herself this role of Queen Mother as a benign role and not, as the wicked Machiavellian queen and so forth. So there are historians who are engaged in it, and I think are finding that there's very little reason to see Catherine in the way that she traditionally has been, except that bias against her. We can also go back and see when she is blamed for St. Bartholomew's Day, and there's always something else going on. It's always at a moment when it's convenient to blame Catherine because we want to support the king. So,
well,
okay.
Thank you again. We have two tokens of this evening in the lectureship. First is a, let us both hold it together somehow. Okay. It's a framed portrait of the poster, and I hope you will enjoy that as much as you will enjoy what's in the envelope.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank everyone for coming.